In part 1, we looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil.
Yes. I remember it well. That static face guy was here.
This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist.
Well, impossible for an all-loving God to exist. Any number of mean-spirited gods are compatible with suffering and evil.
And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails.
Even the atheist philosophers admit this? I guess we're done here.
But wait!
Wait?
It may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely.
We're still arguing? Prophet of Zod.
You rang?
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian, and today 2 former Christians, take a look at the claims of Christians.
Okay, good. You're not just going to abandon me again, are you?
I'll stick around this time.
It was kinda scary last time. Just me and that strange voice reading William Lane Craig arguments, and I didn't even feel like I had all my dimensions intact.
If you missed our first video on the logical problem of evil, tap on the link above our heads, or find the link in the description when we're done here. The order doesn't matter too much.
There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it.
But let me guess. God might always have reasons that our puny minds just don't understand, so... Oh, what am I thinking? No way that will ever come up in this video.
This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely.
Okay, so in the first video, Dr. Craig needed only to present a single possibility in order to defeat the argument. However, this time around he will need to present something that seems probable. Probable even to the skeptic who might be dubious. Merely possible won't cut it.
Is this a good argument?
I beat on this point a lot, but why do we need empirical evidence that something is highly unlikely? You can't just blurt out that a far-fetched, unproven supernatural thing exists, then plant your flag at the top of the mountain and declare that you're the champion and tell other people do all the work of disproving what you've never proven in the first place. Well, I mean, I guess you can if you're content with proving that your almost certainly fictional idea is internally consistent, but they do that with Star Wars too, so...
Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight.
Isn't the Christian God's solution to overcoming the limitations of human knowledge to provide direct revelation in the form of the Bible of what we couldn't know otherwise? We're not only supposed to judge the probability that God has a good reason, but also that these reasons had to necessarily be secret, thereby allowing this problem of evil to cause many to doubt as part of the plan, on top of the evil itself.
God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions.
Notice how they just sneak in the detail that God sees everything and knows everything and whatever. That's skipping a huge step in the conversation. The only thing that's demonstrably happening is that humans are asserting God sees everything and knows everything. And when they demand that we accept this as part of their explanation, they're expecting us to start the conversation by buying into a far-fetched claim we have no proof or even precedent or reference point for. When we doubt this, meaning we don't just instantly accept all their premises from the start, we're not doubting the judgment of a perfectly knowledgeable and wise God. We're doubting humans who say that a perfectly knowledgeable and wise God exists, and then use their assertion of his perfect knowledge and wisdom to account for the multiple indications that he doesn't exist.
In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way.
Minor point, but how can God have to allow anything? Isn't he all-powerful? And do all-powerful people have to do things? I mean, I guess maybe when they're fictional and their followers need to make excuses for stuff, but come on.
Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes, what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator.
Yeah, I suppose that's hypothetically possible, but until you pull back and show us this Creator's purposes, and the Creator himself while you're finally taking the trouble to prove anything, all you're doing is using too many words to suggest possibilities.
He's presenting presuppositions. If you have to presuppose the conclusion for the argument to work, is it an argument?
That's a good question, and I guess it depends on what the theist is trying to argue. If it's that his totally unproven and by all appearances made-up narrative is at least internally consistent, fine. But that's a pretty unambitious place to stop, isn't it? I mean, I could make up a story about pretty much anything right off the top of my head right now. And with a little thought and willingness to weave in unfalsifiable details, I could make it consistent. But it would be a long road from that to something people should take seriously.
Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view.
Okay, but that doesn't change the reasonable initial probability assessment given the information available. New data is always factored in. Until you have some actual data about the motivations of God, this isn't an analogous situation.
In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable.
This seems to be tacit admission that the problem of evil is persuasive against God.
But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion.
Let's see. We have real things are better than imaginary things.
At best proves the universe's origins are unintuitive.
Kalam, but with the munchies.
Can't count without God.
Wanting to avoid pain is a big mystery.
I think, therefore God.
Parable of the puddle.
Music makes me feel feelings.
And for the Bible tells me so.
So when you add these arguments up, you find that 0 plus 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 0 still equals 0. But then I guess when you're pandering to Christians who want to believe anyway, it's always easy to just vaguely allude to the entire body of Christian apologetics and assure them that even if someone just showed that one of your arguments is 0, the ones we're not currently looking at might be more than 0 and, well, there are a lot of them. Look, if you're a Christian, I can assure you I've been there and I sympathize. I had Josh McDowell do this very thing to my face, and I accepted it because it offered me the comfort of a mere suggestion of an answer. And sometimes, if you want to keep believing, it's easy to stop digging and feel comforted by this suggestion. But if, somewhere in the back of your mind, you feel like you might be doing this, I would encourage you to stop and introspect. Really dig into the uncomfortable reality of what's going on in your own mind, asking yourself whether a suggested answer is good enough for you, and if so, why it's enough for you. Really think about whether each argument for your faith, by its own merit, would be sufficient to drive you toward belief in something you don't already believe. Wherever these questions lead you, you owe it to yourself to ask them. And you owe it to yourself to demand more than insinuations from professional apologists.
The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy.
I already touched on this in the previous video, but first off, I don't think anybody thinks God should be obligated to create a comfortable life for his human pets, that the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and that God is obligated to keep us happy. This is a deliberate and frankly dick-headed distraction from what the conversation is actually about, especially when you add the insinuation of the accompanying visuals. There's a world of difference between what we're really saying, which is that an all-powerful, perfectly loving God would protect his creation against unspeakable horrors, and the caricature this video is trying to pin on us, which is that our arguments somehow amount to an expectation that God should give everyone a huge house, a stack of coins, a fancy car, and a butterfly? Whatever. If you're able to address the actual point, then do it. But if not, just admit you can't. There's no point in explaining that God shouldn't have to treat us like spoiled children, because nobody's saying that he should.
However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment.
Does it, though? Because you don't really do anything to demonstrate that this is the case. You just say it is, operating on the assumption that everybody watching the video will believe you, which is one of the many telltale signs that you're just having an inward-focused conversation with your own audience.
Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him.
Again, what kind of suffering? And is there plausible reason to believe people when they tell us the most horrifying and irredeemably pointless forms of suffering serve some greater cause?
The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself.
If the suffering God allows creates a scenario where the individual's normal coping mechanisms have been sufficiently overwhelmed that they must start to look externally in order to cope, has that person really drawn to God freely? Or is this like stealing someone's car in an isolated area, and then later pulling up to the empty spot and offering a ride?
That's a really good question. And in this situation, I see two things God might do. One is the obvious thing, appearing, explaining himself and expressing his love for us in amazingly articulate ways we could never imagine if left to our own devices, and continuing to live among us in such unmistakable form that we would naturally be drawn to who he is. The other is so not obvious that it mirrors precisely what we'd expect to see in a godless universe. Just sitting back and letting us suffer until we run to him by default. Not because of how good he is, but because the alternative to him is horrible. Which just makes him sound like an abusive, "you're lucky to have me" husband.
In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
Hey Paul, what do you think infrastructure, information, and education are like in these orange countries?
I don't know. Those almost seem like measures that could be put up on the screen and be compared and correlated.
And do you think that the fact that poor, uneducated people in the throes of desperation tend to turn to superstition helps reconcile the problem of evil and suffering? Or does it maybe suggest other less supernatural things?
God whispers to us in our pleasures.
Is there some kind of C.S. Lewis ASMR subgenre that I'm not aware of?
I don't know. But if there were, I could shower for the rest of my life and not get the feel of it off me.
Speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Or maybe the intensity of pain is just the intensity of pain.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it.
Just as legends were created to explain how the leopard got its spots, or why lightning strikes across the sky, so too the legend of Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit was created specifically for the purpose of explaining immoral actions. That the explanatory story expects what it's explaining is itself entirely expected.
Well put. Everybody expects moral evil in the world. Christians just view it from within a framework constructed by earlier Christians who built doctrine around it.
The third doctrine states,
Wait, that was the whole second point? Okay.
The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door.
So, forget about it because we promise you'll go to heaven after you die. Yep, that sure is what that one was.
Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament,
But not as much as typical Christians are led to assume. Your Sunday school teacher might have told you that Paul wrote 14 books of the New Testament, but mainstream scholarship agrees on only 7 of those as authentic. But I digress. That's another topic for another day.
underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those sufferings will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it.
So Paul,
The apostle,
a Christian teacher who had every reason to be invested in selling his audience on this point, wrote stories about himself suffering a lot and told his audience he was okay with it, using this as an object lesson in how they should all be okay with suffering because God would magically make it all better later. Again, I must ask, is this compelling to anybody who doesn't already believe the Bible? Is it meant to be compelling to anybody else? Or is it maybe targeted at people who take Paul's words and the word of the Bible as true and insightful from the start and are invested in belief? I'll leave it up to you to decide.
And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good.
that doesn't pair well with my favorite argument against the Christian God, that of divine hiddenness. If knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human experience, an infinite good, then why are there non-resistant non-believers in the world? People who honestly and sincerely seek God, but are simply not convinced that He exists. In Craig's view, creating someone who cannot come to know God must be an infinite evil.
Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, God is good to me.
Is this guy at all aware of how much this sounds like an abusive relationship? It seems like your life is awful, and I let it be awful, but it's all okay because you're lucky to have me in your life. Never mind the fact that, just as heaven uses some weird promise of an unproven eventual good to erase all horrors people go through, this just asserts that knowing God is so good that you can experience endless hunger, beatings, rape, abandonment, illness, and whatever else life throws at you and still come out ahead, despite the fact that this relationship does nothing to demonstrably improve a person's quality of life at all, much less outweigh that kind of hardship.
So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist.
But isn't that first if the huge hurdle we need to get over before any of what you say makes any sense? Or is even a coherent thing to bring into a conversation with a non-believer you hope to convince? I mean, the whole point is that we doubt Christianity is true. So using its own doctrinal statements to reimagine suffering and bypass common sense observations about how any loving, all-powerful being might reasonably deal with suffering, yes, using our human concept of what's reasonable because that's all we have to start a conversation with, speaks to absolutely no one but the already convinced. But as I've said many times, I suspect that's the only crowd you're trying to speak to here. And this video's points, once you stop taking them at face value, actually demonstrate nothing more than how disgusting and manipulative Christian doctrine can be when it's used to speak directly to the flock. It's a summation of all the horrible things said by any pastor who tells his congregation to suffer without question, to expect nothing from this life because even the worst imaginable things that might happen to you are just exercises meant to build character and draw you closer to a God who, trust me, exists. And that it all doesn't matter anyway, because no matter how bad things get, you'll end up in a heaven that, trust me, exists. It trivializes the experiences of those who relentlessly suffer the worst forms of hunger, violence, illness, grief, and abuses, and then has the horrifying gall to tell them they shouldn't expect help from any decent person or God who has the power to rescue them. Then, if that weren't enough, has the cruel audacity to equate their desperate cries for help with a spoiled expectation that God make them perfectly happy and comfortable. If you're outside the faith, you already see this. If you're inside the faith, I hope you can start to see it. And if you deal with suffering, be assured that you deserve to see it. You deserve to acknowledge the reality of what you've gone through, to have it affirmed by others and to receive whatever help they can provide. You deserve better than to be told that you need to see a scripted value in the worst things you've gone through at the times you were most vulnerable, and that you should be expected to, in the process of coping with them, twist them into a spiritual experience that draws you closer to God, because it's just what you would do if your faith were strong enough. And you deserve not to log onto YouTube and find your experiences trivialized for the sake of a cheap apologetic sideshow.
Amen. Since the defense against the argument of evil seems to rely entirely on the extent to which you believe in God before the discussion began, it will continue to be a prominent part of the discussion for those who are skeptical, neutral, or even moderately doubting. Huge thanks once again to Prophet of Zod for alleviating today's suffering. If you aren't already subscribed, fix that right now by tapping on the staticky face on the screen. Then tap on the thumbnail to review the logical problem of evil. Until next time, later.